Welcome, everybody, to the Battle of Gettysburg podcast. I am your co-host, Eric Lindblade, licensed battlefield guide here at Gettysburg National Military Park, and we are recording live from the Reliance Mine Saloon in Gettysburg. Here with my co-host, James Hessler. Jim, what's our topic this week?
Well, thanks, Eric. Today's topic is going to be the pivotal day of June 28th, 1863. It might not be a day that a lot of listeners appreciate being of great significance, but man, June 28th has got something for everybody. Depending on what side of the fence you're on, our title today could be We Move on the Word of an Actor, to talk about General Lee's movements in the Army of Northern Virginia. But on the Army of the Potomac side, trouble comes to George Meade. So those are going to be our two primary areas of focus today, but we've got a lot of good stuff in between the lines to cover both armies.
When we look at June 28th, I don't think it's a stretch to say that outside of a battle day, this could very well be the most important day of the Gettysburg campaign. And I even mean some of the actions late on the retreat near Williamsport and even Falling Waters. I think this whole battle is going to be shifted because of this.
Yeah.
I think everything that kind of comes to Gettysburg a few days later, we can sort of see the genesis of it beginning on June 28th.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's a critical day in the organization and the movements of both armies, perhaps more than any other day. You know, symbolically, did you realize June 28th is Sunday? And it's the beginning of the week, and the battle is going to be fought at the end of the week. So if you're into your symbolism and appreciate this as a story, this is kind of the beginning of the week. It's going to culminate in the great battle. But yeah, the Confederates by this point are deep into Pennsylvania, while the Army of the Potomac under Joe Hooker is still in Maryland. You know, what are these guys doing, trying to follow Lee's army? And as we're going to allude to, I think it's the day that ultimately the movements of the Army of the Potomac are going to force Lee to surrender the initiative, and it's going to start pulling Lee back from Pennsylvania towards the Gettysburg area. So again, we got lots of good stuff to talk about.
This is the day that, I've often said on tours, people ask, why Gettysburg? What caused the battle to come here? And I said, really the armies run into each other. This is what puts these armies on that collision course.
Yeah.
And I think this is the day that if we look at it in hindsight, you put that pin on the map at Gettysburg. And that's where this is going to be taking place. So let's jump right into it.
Yeah, I think this really begins what the military guys in the audience might term movement to contact. And to kind of set the table here, we're going to do a quick recap of where things sit as of June 27th, the prior day. Now remember, following the Battle of Chancellorsville, Hooker has, for the most part, spent the month of June squabbling with Henry Halleck and, to a lesser extent, Abraham Lincoln in Washington, squabbling over his authority and whether or not Hooker can draw on troops from places like Harper's Ferry and the garrison around Washington, D.C. This is all going to build to a head on June 27th when Hooker is going to essentially offer his resignation from command of the Army of the Potomac, principally over this debate over not being allowed to draw troops from Harper's Ferry.
What's going to be interesting about this is the same powers that Hooker was not given on June 27th are the same powers that George Meade's going to get the very next day. We can see that personal relationship, especially between Hooker and Halleck, really coming to a head here.
Yep.
It's not so much Halleck is dug in on this position about the Harper's Ferry garrison. I think he's dug in it because it's Joe Hooker.
Because it's Hooker, I agree. So Hooker's going to tender his resignation, and what he's going to say is, quote, "My original instructions require me to cover Harper's Ferry in Washington. I have now imposed upon me an enemy in my front of more than my number. I am unable to comply with this condition with the means at my disposal and earnestly request that I may at once be relieved from command from the position that I occupy." And that's basically going to be handed up the chain in Washington from Halleck to Lincoln, perhaps somewhat to Hooker's surprise. Resignation accepted. Some historians kind of think maybe Hooker was just kind of bluffing here, trying to say, look, I'm going to leave if you don't give me, the command and the additional troops that I need. But if he was bluffing, Halleck and Lincoln basically call his bluff, and you're out, Joe.
Also, from a political standpoint, this gives Lincoln a little bit of cover. Hooker has resigned. I didn't have to fire him. So I think it looks a little bit better, the optics of it. What's interesting in Hooker's quote, in his resignation, he says that the enemy essentially outnumbers me.
Yeah.
And we often talk about in the Gettysburg campaign the influence of the Bureau of Military Intelligence, how good they are and what's going on. this lends the question of, is he getting really accurate numbers at this point?
Right.
Or is he almost being a little bit of a McClellan? And I've got the numbers, but I don't believe them.
Right.
It's got to be more. Certainly the fact that Lee is coming north. We know that there's been some troops pulled from the Carolinas and Virginia to augment Lee's force. I can understand why maybe Hooker would believe, hey, if Lee's coming north, he's coming from a pretty strong army.
Yeah, and we'll see when Meade takes command on June 28th, this notion that the Army of the Potomac is outnumbered is going to carry through even under Meade's command, which again, as we know in hindsight, obviously a false number. The other thing, though, that I would just add is while it might have given Lincoln an opportunity to kind of say, great, I don't have to fire Hooker, obviously there's an enormous risk being undertaken here because on June 27th, lead elements of the Army of Northern Virginia, Ewell's 2nd Corps, are in and around the Carlisle area, while the vast majority of the Army of the Potomac is still south of Frederick, Maryland. So Lincoln and Halleck, while accepting Hooker's resignation, and I think they had to because it just seemed like the wheels had come off the wagon for Hooker, so I think they didn't have any choice. But the enormous risk, of course, is now you're going to be basically changing captains, changing generals of the Army midstream here with the enemy deep, and I mean deep into Pennsylvania territory.
And not only that, pressing against the capital of the second largest state in the Union at that time. If we look at electoral politics the next year, if you want to be president, you got to win Pennsylvania.
Oh, yeah, right.
And I think if the Confederate flag raises over Harrisburg, Lincoln's going to have to pull off a miracle to win this state.
Yeah, today, if the Confederates captured Harrisburg, they could keep it. We don't want it. But
No,
in
no.
1863, it was a big deal.
Yeah,
and it absolutely would have been a huge blow to the administration.
Certainly today, it's the most uncapital-like capital in the United States, but I think it would have a major effect because this would also be a Union capital now in Confederate hands, even if it was for a day or two.
Yeah. Now, one of the things as I was doing kind of my prep work for the episode, a little reminder that I found interesting. Obviously now as Halleck and Lincoln have to decide quickly on Hooker's replacement, it was an interesting reminder to me that one of the men who was still in contention was John Sedgwick. Uncle John, our Gettysburg battlefield tours, hardly ever mentioned on the typical battlefield tour, although he has a beautiful equestrian monument as you come off a little round top, and that often catches the eye of the visitor. You know, Sedgwick's 6th Corps, and we're not going to go too deep into the weeds on this, but Sedgwick's 6th Corps doesn't play that much of a role in the Battle of Gettysburg. So it was an interesting reminder to me, though, and hopefully a reminder to some of the viewers or the listeners. We're not doing this on video, are we, Eric?
Not yet.
Not yet. Right.
Who knows?
So,
maybe one day.
So a reminder to some of the listeners that, again, Sedgwick was highly ranked and highly regarded within the Army of the Potomac. And, again, it was Sedgwick was one of the guys on the table for consideration. I thought that was kind of an interesting FYI.
Rather than kind of get in the weeds, the various individuals that have been talked about and maybe taking command, that might be actually a good episode on its own one day to kind of weigh the merits of each and kind of get into that.
Right.
But I think what we see is that, Lincoln and Halleck have to make a choice quick. And I think what they are looking at is a dependable, capable commander in George Meade. Maybe not the most flashy guy, but a guy that, generally speaking, gets the job done.
Well, at that point, you can kind of question how much of an untested commodity Meade is. I mean, again, he's been great at the brigade, division, and corps level, but in terms of whether or not Meade can command an army. But I do think also the fact that Meade is a native Pennsylvanian and free from, what we're going to call the political intrigue that was surrounding the Army of the Potomac, I think are, going to be the primary factors that work in his favor.
It's interesting with Meade, other than really sort of what we would consider the Hooker camp of the Army of the Potomac, Meade has kind of been able to kind of cross through some of these cliques and rivalries in the Army. He's one high-ranking officer that comes through relatively unscathed. I don't think he's necessarily painted with the McClellan brush. He's not really considered a political player. I think he's really the right guy at the right time. If you were sort of looking at going to central casting for the guy that you want to be in command of this Army right now, George Meade simply fits that.
Yeah, I think I would agree. I think the biggest challenge, one of the biggest challenges, obviously, that Meade has, other than the fact that he doesn't seem to want the job, at least he says he doesn't. Now, I've read some of Meade's letters at the Historical Society in Philadelphia, and you can kind of argue if Meade is maybe a little more ambitious than he's often been portrayed as. But I think one of the challenges he's going to have here, obviously, in the command transfer is in the months leading up to Gettysburg, post-Chancellorsville. Obviously, Meade had more or less run afoul of Hooker, Butterfield and Sickles, which is going to have some impact not only on the command transfer, but then obviously Butterfield remaining as Chief of Staff for the Army.
So now we are on the early morning hours of June 28th. It's at this time, as historians have said, that trouble now comes to George Meade. So tell us a little about what's that trouble coming down the pike for George Meade.
Yeah, so with the Army of the Potomac in and around Frederick, Maryland, 3 a.m. in the morning on June 28th, Colonel James Hardee of Halleck's staff comes into Meade's tent and essentially awakens him with the message that he has come to bring George Meade trouble. We know Meade is kind of a high-strung guy. We know Meade doesn't really want this job. Tensions are high. But, every time I read that, I got to think, come on, Hardee. Couldn't you have done a better job of waking him up with good news? I mean, we always make a big deal then about how agitated Meade is at receiving the news. But you know what? If somebody came into my tent at 3 o'clock in the morning, woke me up and said, hey, I'm here to bring you trouble, I'd probably think I was being arrested too.
And that's what George Meade certainly thinks.
That's what Meade thinks.
I think he's thinking I'm about to be locked up here for a little bit.
Yeah. So nearly by all accounts, Meade is agitated. Again, I don't blame him given that wake-up call, but he's agitated. He's protesting that he really doesn't expect or want command of the Army, and at least by some accounts seems to be thinking, hey, what about Reynolds? I thought you were going to give this to John Reynolds. Man, I was already ready to congratulate Reynolds. And you got all that stuff going on, and Hardee's saying, no, General Meade, the order is yours. Now, I've got the order here that I'll read.
Yeah, and I think it's clear to point out that Meade's not asked. I mean, Meade's being ordered to take command, so as an officer in the United States Army, he's getting an order from his direct superior. So really his option right now is to either say yes or resign.
Right.
Either way, he's got a momentous decision to make.
Right. There's essentially a conversation to that effect, and Hardee says to me, you don't really have the option of doing that. Let me read a little bit from the passage. I'm not going to read the whole thing. It's a lengthy order. Y'all can find this in the ORs, for example, if you want to get to the whole passage. But with a couple of highlights here. General, you will receive with this order of the President placing you in command of the Army of the Potomac. Considering the circumstances, no one ever received a more important command, and I cannot doubt that you will fully justify the confidence which the government has reposed in you. Now, this is Halleck's order to Meade, and Halleck goes from there to kind of set some conditions upon General Meade. Halleck says, quote, you will not be hampered by any minute instructions from these headquarters. Your army is free to act as you may deem proper under circumstances as they arise. You will, however, keep in view the important fact that the Army of the Potomac is the covering army of Washington, as well as the army of operation against the invading force of the rebels. You will therefore maneuver and fight in such a manner as to cover the capital and also Baltimore as far as circumstances will admit. So right off the bat, Meade is basically being told, look, you've got to maneuver to fight Lee's army, but in doing so, you cannot uncover Washington, D.C. And Baltimore. And obviously that's going to limit Meade's flexibility. But I think also, too, it gives Meade sort of a good framework to kind of understand that this is what I've got to do. This is what you've been ordered to do. This
is sort of different than what other commanders of the Army of the Potomac have maybe been given. What exactly is expected of you beyond defeat the enemy? Mm-hmm. I think Meade's given very clear rules, ideas of what he needs to do. He knows that. So I think it also takes a little bit of pressure off of George Meade of having to think about what exactly do I need to do here. Mm-hmm. I know what my orders are.
Right.
I execute them, and then I can maneuver against Robert E. Lee's army. So it gives him, even though it somewhat ties his hands a little bit, it does give him, I think, some flexibility and a little bit of freedom.
I agree. And I personally think a lot of Gettysburg historians always treat this like, no, it severely limits, it severely hinders Meade's movements. Not really. As you said, and I think I agree, tells Meade pretty clearly this is what's expected of you, and I think that works. A couple other things I'll just mention. All forces within the sphere of your operations will be held subject to your orders. Harper's Ferry and its garrison are under your direct orders. So again, as we said in the intro, this was an ongoing bone of contention between Halleck and Hooker. Hooker basically wanted to draw troops out of Harper's Ferry to let them operate against Lee's army. Halleck said no. A day later, Meade is in command, and guess who has authority over Harper's Ferry?
This is where, if ever there's been an army in American history that has had personalities impact it more than any other, it's the Army of the Potomac. And I think this is a prime example of that. It's personal animosity getting in the way of maybe what is best militarily. Hooker's argument is a valid one. I mean, we've got these troops here. What are we going to do with them? Now Meade gets this ability to now have these troops a day later. The military situation has not changed so drastically that the Harper's Ferry garrison is now freed up to potentially take part in this campaign. It's really that relationship between Halleck and Hooker coming to a head.
Yeah, and bringing up the personalities leads to the next passage in the report, in the order. You are authorized to remove from command and to send from your army any officer or other person you may deem proper, and to appoint to command as you may deem expedient. And again, we know, we'll talk about this more when we get to our July 1st episode, the whole issue out here on Cemetery Hill with Hancock and Howard and how that all plays out. But again, it's noteworthy to acknowledge that Meade is given these instructions right off the bat that, look, buddy, this is your team. This is your team. You put in the lineup whoever you want, and we're going to back you up.
Both these quotes together, what we see is Meade's given what he's expected to do. But however he goes about doing it, I don't think there's really any push one way or the other. As long as you're protecting Baltimore, you're protecting Washington, and you're going after Lee, we don't really care how you do it. Just get the job done. The biggest thing that I take away from this is what they're really telling Meade, we need a win here. Mm-hmm. This is not repulse the enemy. This is not get them out. We need a win, because I think they see the impact that this could have politically and militarily on this war in the summer of 1863.
Yeah, while you're talking here, I'm just looking at Meade's correspondence to his wife. As we know, Meade was very active in writing letters home to his family. Good family man. George Meade, that's our guy, right?
He was. He is a stand-up guy. And actually, if you read his letters, at times he's actually this very tender, nice guy. I think a far cry from the goggle-eyed snapping turtle with the volcanic temper that we like to think of. He's a guy that maybe on the job is a bit of a pain to work with at times, but I think at home, by all accounts, a really decent guy.
Right. And Meade tells his wife, quote, "At first I thought it was either to relieve or arrest me, and promptly replied that my conscience was clear, void of offense toward any man. I was prepared for his bad news." Again, Meade then goes on talking about how Hardee handed him the communication to read, which I found was an order relieving Hooker from the command and assigning it to me. And this is the passage I'm looking for. "As dearest, you know how reluctant we both have been to see me placed in this position, and as it appears to be God's will for some good purpose, at any rate as a soldier, I had nothing to do but accept and exert my utmost abilities to command success." That's George Meade.
George Meade in a nutshell, folks. That just sort of speaks to who he is. And what we're going to see now is Meade is ordered to take command. Right. He is now in this role. And now we start to move into an interesting period where the new boss is going to have a meeting with the old boss. Right. Maybe what we call, maybe for lack of a better term, the exit interview for Joseph Hooker. There's a lot of questions that we've had actually from listeners about this moment. So we'll kind of start getting into that a little bit about this meeting now that Hooker is going to have with George Meade.
Yeah, so there seems to be no doubt, well, there is no doubt that Meade has an interview with Hooker, and how long it lasts depends on which account you read. The meeting seems to last for a couple of hours before Hooker eventually departs the army. Meade said, and I'm going to find the quote here from his testimony later in spring of 1864 before the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, but essentially what Meade will testify later on was that General Hooker left the camp in a very few hours after I relieved him. And this is Meade talking. "I received from him no intimation of any plan or any views that he may have had up to that moment, and I am not aware that he had any, but was waiting for the exigencies of the occasion to govern him, just as I had to subsequently." And this sort of starts Meade's position that essentially, look, Hooker didn't tell me a whole lot. He didn't tell me where the Union Army was. He didn't tell me where Lee's army was. And frankly, if Hooker had any plan, he didn't tell me about it.
And this is actually a question that we had from a listener on our Facebook page about whether or not did Hooker purposefully keep information from George Meade. There's a couple ways we can interpret this. There's some accounts that Hooker maybe really didn't have a real plan at this point. I think he's just sort of reacting to what's happening. If you don't have a real plan, what can you really keep from him? Now, there could be issues of what did he tell him about the disposition of the Army of the Potomac? What did he tell him about where Lee's army is at this point? We don't really know the full details of that meeting.
Yeah, and before we get into that, I want to acknowledge that the question came from super fan Scott in Massachusetts. Scott, I hope you're listening out there and are enjoying the podcast. Scott is one of the most knowledgeable people I know on the Battle of Gettysburg and the source material related to the Gettysburg campaign. Good guy, even if he is a Red Sox fan. So, yeah, Charles Benjamin left an account about this meeting in Battles and Leaders. And it's interesting reading, if nothing else. But what Benjamin said was essentially that Hooker seems to have sort of dressed himself for the occasion, and apparently given what he viewed as a delay in response from Washington, Hooker might have thought that he was going to be getting a different outcome from Hardee in Washington. When Hooker found out that, in essence, his bluff had been called, Hooker could not, quote, wholly mask the revulsion of feeling at the news. So I think Hooker is really kind of punched in the face, so to speak, by this news. I don't think he was expecting them to accept his resignation. So with now Hardee and Meade coming to Hooker's tent to kind of have this meeting and to find out, oh, by the way, General Hooker, you are out, I think Hooker's got to kind of overcome that shock pretty quickly. So that's one thing Benjamin talks about. The other thing Benjamin mentions is, again, obvious coldness that exists between Butterfield and Meade, which, again, as we said earlier, is going to have interesting ramifications later when Meade asks Butterfield to remain on as chief of staff through the battle. But as they start talking and talk about the position of the armies, Benjamin writes that Meade unguardedly expressed himself as shocked at the scattered condition of the Army of the Potomac. And Hooker retorted with feeling. So you can kind of see Meade, again, probably not pulling any punches and saying, my God, this is how spread out we are. And Hooker kind of saying, oh, wait a minute, who do you think you're talking to, kind of thing. And given that I think the two of them really did not like each other anyways, again, going back to some prior personal history, Benjamin talks about it really being a tension-filled meeting. Hooker's chagrin and Meade's overstrung nerves made the lengthy but indispensable conference rather trying to the whole party.
There's no way to get around. This was a difficult meeting. I don't think anybody's happy to be in that room right now. What we see, I think what interests me is the length of the meeting. Mm-hmm. And I think there's some accounts that sort of place it maybe in the 2.5 hour ballpark. If I remember correctly, I think it's around 10 a.m. that Meade is going to wire Henry Halleck basically saying, I'm in charge now. And so we at least know that this is somewhere around this time frame. So if they're talking for that amount of time, they have to have something substantive.
Yeah, I would agree. Now, I think you touched on it a little bit earlier. If you've ever read Meade's correspondence, really going back to the Chancellorsville campaign, Meade has been complaining, serving under Hooker, he's been complaining that Hooker keeps the Corps commanders in the dark over enemy dispositions, over dispositions within the Army of the Potomac. So I think this idea that Meade comes into the tent and says, you got to be kidding me, we're this spread out, I think to me that has a definite ring of truth to it. That was always one of Meade's top complaints about Hooker, was that Hooker did not communicate to subordinates.
A lot of that is Hooker's paranoia at this point.
Yeah.
Hooker has very few people to trust in the Army, really outside of a select few officers, probably
Right.
Dan Sickles among them. So our weekly Dan Sickles report
Coming up
next. This is where Meade is I think he is shocked. And I think also Meade's in a position where he's got to find a lot of information very quickly. I don't have time to beat around the bush.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Tell me what I need to know so I can start making some decisions.
So I can get things going. Yeah, and I think, and again, you might have touched on it earlier, I think the genesis of this is that, no, at this point, Hooker doesn't have a plan. Mm-hmm. He's moving north. He's not moving north very rapidly. As I said earlier, at this point, Confederates are in and around the Carlisle area, continuing up towards Wrightsville and Harrisburg. And, the Army of the Potomac is barely scraping into Frederick, Maryland at this point. So I don't think Hooker has a plan. Now, again, you can argue whether or not that's appropriate. Look, the idea is you're going to go north and you're going to meet and contact the enemy at some point and bring on a battle. But I think all of this squabbling that Hooker has and this general belief that he's outnumbered, doesn't have enough men, is just hindering his movements, such to the effect that guy really doesn't have a plan. And I like Hooker as a general. I think he's great at lower levels at Antietam. Been interesting to see what would have happened if Hooker had stayed in command, but it's not to be.
As Hooker departs, he's actually sent to Baltimore, Maryland.
Yeah.
Which, if we look at this point in the campaign, it's not like he's being sent totally away. Mm-hmm. There's always the threat that Baltimore could be threatened, and here he is in Baltimore. I mean, not that it's going to happen, but it's not like he's just being given a desk in Washington, out of sight, out of mind. Right. There is still maybe some realization that he could potentially be useful in certain areas, just not as commander of the Army of the Potomac.
Yeah, so getting back to the movements of the Army, one of the things, too, that I think is interesting, given how deep into Pennsylvania and how far ahead of the Union Army the Confederates are, Butterfield, and maybe even Hooker says this, I forget, but I know at least Butterfield says later that the plan had basically been for the Army to rest around Frederick on the 28th and not even move again until the 29th. So, not only is the Army of the Potomac really moving kind of slowly, but had Hooker stayed in command, they would have lost a whole nother day, June 28th, basically just resting in and around Frederick. And I think Meade taking command and getting everybody moving is one of the immediate benefits of that changeover.
We try never to play the what-if game. That's one of the most frustrating things we get. What if this happened, or what if this person made this decision? I think, though, we can look at this and realistically say, if Richard Ewell's men had had another day, there's a good chance Harrisburg would have been in their grasp.
Yeah.
Or at least an attempt would have been made.
Right.
And
Agreed.
so I think we look at this as kind of one of those moments where it maybe doesn't get a lot of attention as we look at this bigger picture, but when we kind of dive into June 28th, this delay that could have happened, that doesn't, because Meade gets everybody moving, it's going to play a role down the road.
And so ultimately, this whole question, getting back and kind of closing the loop on Scott's question, whether or not Hooker had a plan and did Hooker communicate that plan to Meade, kind of comes back to that resolution that is then passed in the early spring of 1864, in many ways crediting Hooker and Howard and a couple other people. And oh, by the way, George Meade, crediting these guys with the Gettysburg victory and really, really stating that Meade had more or less just followed Hooker's plans. I know this is what Scott is getting to in his question. And, I think from the point of view, I would agree that Hooker didn't really have a plan, and probably from that point of view didn't have a lot to communicate to Meade. But what he did have to communicate to Meade was the position of the Army of the Potomac, at least some intelligence about the position and the strength of the Confederate Army that, frankly, is going to turn out to be inaccurate.
This is the moment where, for Hooker, if we look back to this question, how can I keep you in the dark if I don't really have a plan?
Yeah.
That's kind of where we go into with most of these issues. Unless we're in the room, we're never going to fully have a clear answer on this. We can kind of glean from some of it. It's a commander that is in George Meade that's ready to get started, ready to start making some moves here.
Yeah.
And I think there's also a commander in Joseph Hooker that maybe during that meeting, I think he's become more resigned to the fact that I'm ready to leave.
Yeah, maybe.
I think there's a combination of both in there, and I think those personalities at play.
Hooker feels tired to me. In prepping for this, going through the ORs and reading the messages and the communications that are going back and forth on June 27th, there just isn't a lot there. Again, there's a lot of stuff going back and forth. Can I have Harper's Ferry? No, you can't have Harper's Ferry. Can I have troops from Baltimore? No, you can't have troops from Baltimore. That sort of thing. But, man, it just doesn't seem like there's a lot going on the 27th, which, again, is going to be radically different post-June 28th when Meade takes command.
Too, with Hooker, because it's kind of an outside-of-the-box thought, by all accounts, he's concussed at Chancellorsville.
Yeah.
And I think anybody that we know today with head injuries, you don't just get over a head injury next week. You make the point he's tired.
Yeah.
One of the long-term issues of head injury and head trauma is you're lethargic, you're tired, you're a little irrational. All these things are maybe coming into play. As I was reading through this, I'm thinking we often talk about Lee's health. What about Hooker's health?
What about Hooker's
health?
health?
I'd love to actually maybe one day talk to a neurologist. What's going on with Hooker? What's going on in his head? How is this impacting his decisions he's making moving forward?
Hey, before we move on then, should I read a few relevant passages from Meade's wiring of acceptance? It's actually timed at 7 a.m., but is received at 10 a.m.
Right.
Okay, so I'm just going to kind of tell you then how ultimately Meade accepts command, and then we'll move on. So Meade to Halleck. Meade essentially says, the order placing me in command of this army is received. As a soldier, I obey it, and to the utmost of my ability will execute it. I love this next part. Totally unexpected as it has been, and in ignorance of the exact condition of the troops and position of the enemy, I can only now say that it appears to me that I must move toward the Susquehanna, keeping Washington and Baltimore well covered. There's those orders again to keep those two cities covered. Keeping Washington and Baltimore well covered, and if the enemy is checked in his attempt to cross the Susquehanna, or if he turns toward Baltimore, to give him battle. I would say that I trust every available man that can be spared will be sent up to me, as from all accounts the enemy is in strong force. So soon as I can post myself up, I will communicate more in detail.
So what I think we're seeing now is essentially a new era of the Army of the Potomac beginning right before our eyes.
Yeah, I think that's well said, Eric. And one way that new era begins is John Reynolds. John Reynolds comes to Meade's tent during the course of the morning and congratulates Meade on the promotion. Meade assures Reynolds that, John, we wish it was you. The Army was looking to you. But Reynolds assures Meade that he has his hearty cooperation, which is going to be critical during the movement of the Army over the next couple of days, as Meade will more and more rely on Reynolds as a wing commander to get things into action, which will, of course, lead to July 1st here at Gettysburg. Should we move to today's Dan Sickles report?
I think we need our weekly Dan Sickles report, absolutely. What's Dan doing right now?
Today's Dan Sickles report is brought to you by Sickles at Gettysburg, my 2009 award-winning biography of General Sickles, available everywhere fine books are sold.
It is a fine book indeed.
Thank you, guys. So the Dan Sickles report, it's just kind of interesting that the same train that brought James Hardie with the orders relieving Hooker from command and placing Meade in command, that train also included Dan Sickles, who was returning to the Army of the Potomac. Sickles had apparently been wounded following Chancellorsville, and I think if there's something in the medical record about him suffering from a case of diarrhea or something to that effect. But Sickles has essentially been away from the Army for a few weeks, but he's coming back, and he's on the same train moving into Frederick that Hardie is on. Sickles complains later that Hardie sat next to him during the entire train ride, chatting away, and didn't once give Sickles a clue as to what his mission was. Oh, the intrigue. So he complains about that, but Sickles says then that when he reports to camp, he meets with Hooker, and Sickles actually offers to resign with Hooker, but Hooker talks him out of it. So I know we don't want to play the what-if game, but folks, is the way the Battle of Gettysburg is going to unfold over the next couple of days, imagine the impact of that decision on the outcome of the battle. So I am going to throw a what if out here. What if Dan Sickles had resigned along with Hooker? And that is today's edition of the Dan Sickles Report.
After the Dan Sickles report, that kind of puts a bow on the Army of the Potomac a little bit at this moment. We'll kind of come back to them a little bit here. Now let's shift our attention over to the Army in Northern Virginia. What's going on with Lee's Army at this point? As we look at the Army, Lee's Army's fairly spread out over a pretty wide front in south central Pennsylvania. We've got elements of the Confederate Army that are in the Chambersburg area, about 30 miles west of Gettysburg. For those of you, if you're looking at a map, as we mentioned before, the Confederate Army is in and around the Carlisle area, just south of the state capital of Harrisburg, right along the Susquehanna River. And we have another portion of Lee's Army to the east, even east of York, Pennsylvania, in the Wrightsville area. So we see that Lee's Army is spread out, well placed here in south central Pennsylvania. Still at this point, thinking they've got a little bit of wiggle room here, a little bit of room to maneuver. Of course, as we see, things are soon going to change for Lee's Army.
Right. Ultimately, at this point, as far as the Army of Northern Virginia is concerned, the Army of the Potomac is not in Pennsylvania yet. So imagine the enemy army more or less just running unfettered through the Keystone State. You know, Eric, you mentioned the movements in and around Susquehanna at Wrightsville. Of course, keep in mind, too, that unfortunately that day the bridge at Wrightsville is set on fire. And I think, you know, sort of Early's logistical hopes of using the bridge to kind of cross the river is dashed. So although that doesn't put kind of the stamp on Lee's forward movements, I think symbolically you're kind of already starting to see the worm turn here a little bit for General Lee's advance.
It's interesting to look it up to June 28th. What has really gone wrong for Lee's army in this campaign? There's very few issues. I think Lee could not have drawn this up any better. With Ewell's advance through the Shenandoah Valley, we look at they move into Pennsylvania. This is going at pretty much what Lee wants. I think the one issue is the absence of Stuart.
Yes.
That's the one thing Lee would be a little concerned about. On the whole, Lee's kind of looking at this, and I think on June 28th is still feeling relatively good about where he's at.
Yeah, and I think with the exception of Stuart, which I think we'll probably come to in a moment here, you know, so far this feels like a large and very successful raid. You know, just going through these towns, going through Gettysburg, going through Chambersburg, going through York, that sort of thing. It feels like a very large and, up to this point, pretty successful raid. Again, Stuart, though, is a big exception to that.
If you read the letters of the rank and file in Lee's army, they really attest to that. Mm-hmm. You almost get the sense this isn't a dire military campaign. This is sort of a jaunt in Northern Territory. I mean, they're talking about barns, they're talking about farms, they're talking about how ugly the women are in South Central Pennsylvania. You see all of this coming into play, and it gives you a really good insight into what the mood of that army was up to this point. Of course, June 28th, things will drastically change.
Right. Should we talk about Stuart first?
You know what? I think let's get into Stuart first, then we can kind of get into what's going on
and come
elsewhere.
Into it. Yeah, so Stuart crosses the Potomac River at Rouser's Ford about 3 a.m. on June 28th. Upon entering Maryland, the cavalrymen then do some damage along the C&O Canal, which is one of the major supply lines for the Army of the Potomac, capturing some canal boats and cargo. When I think of Stuart in June 28th, jumps out at me is I think Stuart's general belief that his own procurement of supplies and disruption of the like behind federal lines, but especially I think Stuart's belief that procurement of supplies is a critical component of his orders from Lee. Stuart is not out joyriding, folks. Mm-hmm. Stuart has gotten cut off a little bit, and June 28th and beyond is going to kind of exasperate that problem. But Stuart is at least meeting what he thinks the condition of his orders were in terms of gathering supplies.
It's somewhat challenging for Stuart because if you're going to have to gather, if in his mind at least, I have to gather supplies, I need to also move fairly quickly as I'm doing this, and also try to do some damage to the enemy's territory. You can do one or two of those at a time. It's very difficult to do all three. And I think we sort of see this sort of compounding onto Stuart as he's going through. He's also getting blocked at key points before and after. He's kind of looking at the scoreboard almost, seeing the clock is kind of ticking down a little bit. We got to start moving here. Otherwise, we could be in a tough spot.
Yeah, and so Stuart's command enters Rockville, Maryland on June 28th, and essentially they capture somewhere in the vicinity of 125 wagons. Sometimes I see 125. I've seen as high as 140. But they capture somewhere in the vicinity of 125 wagons in and around Rockville. And that element that Eric just talked about, the necessary speed of movement, at this point is going to more or less come grinding to a halt with the capture of these wagons.
And I think that's something to keep in mind, too. These wagons are being pulled by heavy draft horses. They're made for strength. They're not made for speed. So we now have an element of Stuart's column that's not going to be able to move as rapidly as Stuart's men without this. There's some that could argue the best thing he could have done there, just burn those wagons. Of course, as we're going to see, if you're also working in a giant raid, if you will, to gather supplies, over 100 wagons is important. You need wagons to get those supplies out. And as we're going to see, some of these wagons are also going to help Lee's army carry wounded out of Pennsylvania as well.
That's a good point. Yeah, and again, we'll probably do a whole separate JEB Stuart episode to get into the weeds on this. But again, it's an important moment for Stuart on June 28th. It's something that is going to progressively, from this point, slow him down. Any potential thoughts he might have had as far as reaching Hanover, Pennsylvania, for example, by the late 28th or into the 29th are going to be dashed. And by the 29th, Stuart is still going to be in Maryland, and he's going to get into a clash at Westminster. So June 28th, not a great day for JEB Stuart in terms of his movements.
Now, as we've sort of turned from Stuart, I think now let's look at Stuart's commander, Robert E. Lee. What's Lee going to be told now on June 28th, which I think is, up to this point, the worst news that Lee has heard in the Gettysburg campaign up to this point?
So it happens on the evening of June 28th with Lee and Longstreet in and around the Chambersburg area. A spy or a scout, often known as Harrison, comes into camp and informs Lee that Hooker's army has moved north of the Potomac River. You know, this is one of the campaign's many dramatic human interest moments. Lee is not learning this critical intelligence from his cavalry or from JEB Stuart. It's just from a scout that has been hired by Longstreet, and it's this one man coming into camp with the word that is ultimately going to change Lee's movements, for the entire campaign.
If you look at Lee at this moment, one thing that will help Harrison's case is he's a Longstreet guy.
Mm-hmm.
Being hired by Longstreet, having that relationship with Longstreet, Lee certainly thinks incredibly high of Longstreet. Even before Jackson's death, Longstreet, Lee considers is his most trusted subordinate. I know there's some Jackson fans out there that are now going to be throwing things, but the evidence is there that I think Lee, it's not just fluff calling him my old warhorse. Harrison's relationship with Longstreet, I think, gives him at least some credibility with Lee, because on paper, the word of one scout or spy that you're moving your entire army based on that, it's a pretty significant risk.
Yeah, that was not something that Lee normally would have fallen back on, the word of one particular scout or one particular spy. So I agree, kind of getting a Longstreet's stamp of approval on it is going to be critical. And, when they come into camp, Lee questions Harrison carefully about the details of it. And quite frankly, Harrison's intelligence is not 100% accurate, as is often the case here, but it's not completely accurate. He tells Lee that the Army of the Potomac crossed the Potomac and is moving north, but he also tells Lee that movements of the Union Army seem to indicate that the Yankees are heading west towards the mountain range and are going to potentially cut off Lee's supply and communication lines. So it's this erroneous assumption that Hooker's army is moving to the west that's going to cause Lee to kind of rein in his scattered army to protect those same supply and communication lines at South Mountain.
This is not going to be the first time in the next coming days that Lee is going to be making decisions on what we might consider bad or erroneous intelligence. This is starting to set a bit of a pattern for Lee moving forward. If you want to fault Stuart here, Lee's famously going to say after Stuart's death, he never brought me a bad piece of information,
right.
Something along that line. Lee's having to make decisions on information from sources that maybe are not the best at gathering this information. There's an art to gathering intelligence on the battlefield, and Stuart was very good at that. Mm-hmm. And this is where we often talk about Lee entering Pennsylvania blind. This is a great example of that. So Lee is not only having to decide what his army is going to do, but he's also trying to figure out what exactly his opponent's going to do. And he's doing this with very little real, definite information.
Right. Lee has cavalry with him. He doesn't have Stuart with him. And Stuart is the guy that he wants, as you said, that has the skill to gather reliable information. Well said, Eric. I'm just going to then sort of measure Lee's response from his July 31st OR, which I think summarizes his thoughts well. Lee says that preparations were being made to advance upon Harrisburg, but on the night of the 28th, information was received from a scout that the Federal Army had crossed the Potomac, was advancing northward, and that the head of the column had reached the South Mountain. As our communications with the Potomac were thus menaced, it was resolved to prevent his farther progress in that direction by concentrating our army on the east side of the mountains. Accordingly, Longstreet and Hill were directed to proceed from Chambersburg to Gettysburg, to which point General Ewell was also instructed to march from Carlisle.
And this is sort of now setting the stage for what we're going to see on July 1st. This is a key moment in the history of the Army of Northern Virginia, because up until June 28th, from if we look at the start of the campaign, the early part of the month to now, Lee is now responding to the Army of the Potomac.
Right.
Up to this point, the Army of the Potomac's been responding to him. He's been controlling the tempo and direction of this campaign. Now, Lee is pretty much now having to react to the Union Army. That's a point that Lee is not always comfortable in. Lee is a commander, we often talk about him being aggressive. Lee is always searching for the initiative in a campaign. He wants to drive the action. Now, he's not getting to do that as much as I think he would want to just 24 hours before this point.
Exactly. Lee's becoming reactionary. And going back to what I said earlier, too, with Meade now in command, what would have been a rest day for the Army of the Potomac is taken off the table, and he immediately starts moving north. Again, it's this meeting to contact that we talked about in the intro. Both sides now are going to be jockeying for position, and as we know, are ultimately going to collide in and around Gettysburg.
Did have a listener question from Tim about whether or not did Harrison inform Robert E. Lee that George Meade is the commander. We know that he's talking about the Army of the Potomac. Does he actually inform Lee that Hooker's out, Meade's in?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and most accounts seem to credit Harrison, the spy, the scout, with providing Lee that information. Longstreet's memoirs, for example, say that Harrison brought the news of Meade's assignment. Now, again, I don't want to reference the movie Gettysburg, but look, it has a tremendous influence on how people view the battle, even to the effect that sometimes, you have to pause and think, okay, did I read this in a book or did I see it in the movie kind of thing?
And let's note, most people right now listening to this is the image playing in their head as we're talking about this right now. So
I will read a line from the movie, right, where Longstreet says, oh, by the way, it's like, by the way, like it's an afterthought. Oh, by the way, Hooker's been replaced. George Meade, Harrison read about it in the Yankee papers. One of the things that I did was I kind of went back just to say, okay, when did this news actually start showing up in the Yankee papers? And although my search was not all comprehensive, but I did some searching in newspaper archives to try to get a general sense of when this was reported. As y'all can probably imagine, if Meade accepts command on the morning of June 28th, 1863. It's not really going to be showing up in papers later that same day. Communications just wasn't that fast back then. However, it was showing up in newspapers as of June 29th, the following day. The Washington Evening Star of June 29th, 1863. Extra, a new commander for the Army of the Potomac, which announced that George Meade had been placed in command of the Army and also included a little biographical sketch of Meade. The Baltimore Sun, June 29th, under War News, says a dispatch from Harrisburg states, etc., that General Meade is appointed as successor to General Hooker. So at least it seems to be that this was really making the newspapers on June 29th. So if you accept that Lee learned of Hooker's replacement on the 28th, then he probably didn't get it from the newspapers. And then you got to ask, well, okay, did he get it from Harrison or did he get it from some other source? It's about 55 miles from Frederick to Chambersburg, so he could not have spent too much of that day hanging out in Frederick.
By all accounts, June 29th is when this is hitting the press.
Right.
I think we also have to look at how news travels in an army, because at the first meeting, nobody really knows outside of Hardee, Meade, probably Meade's staff, and then eventually Hooker and his staff, and then, of course, Sickles. But we have to think of then how this gets disseminated through the rest of the Army. And did maybe Lee know on June 28th that Meade is in command? Maybe. I think it would be a stretch for Harrison that word could have traveled that quickly through the Army to where Harrison can then find somebody in the know. That's not saying that he didn't. Maybe he did come across a staff officer that had this information. If he doesn't know on June 28th, I think certainly by June 29th, Lee is now going to know.
Right.
Lee had access to papers. Lee was a voracious reader of the Northern press. If he doesn't know on June 28th, he definitely knows on June 29th.
Yeah, and I think that's right. Now, Armistead Long, Lee's military secretary, writing many years later, said that it was not until the night of the 28th that Lee learned that the enemy had reached Frederick. This important information was brought by a scout from Hood's Texas Brigade. We know that's not quite accurate. And then in a separate passage, he talks about the change in command. And Armistead Long implies that, yes, Lee did learn about it on the night of the 28th, but it's kind of a separate passage and doesn't quite clearly say that, by the way, we also got that same information from the spy. What I think, too, is interesting is in Lee's report, he never really reports, I should say, because as we know, Lee's got a couple reports. He never really addresses the topic. The first reference that Lee has to this is in his January 1864 report, where he basically says it was ascertained from prisoners gathered on July 1st that we had engaged with 2 corps of the Army formerly commanded by Hooker, and that the remainder of the Army under Meade was approaching Gettysburg. And that's really Lee's first reference in any of his reports to George Meade. So, again, I think some of the Confederate accounts written later tend to say, yes, Lee knew about it on the night of June 28th. I'm kind of skeptical. I'm thinking at best Lee knew about the changeover in command on the 29th. And if that, I'm kind of drawing my line in the sand on the 29th.
Also, as an Army commander, you hear this information. If you ever read soldiers' letters, somebody could do a really interesting book on rumors that floated through Civil War camps that are sometimes the most outlandish things you've ever heard. It's kind of this trust but verify. So it could very well be he first finds word of this on the 29th. Maybe it's not until the 1st that he can actually confirm it, that you're getting rank and file from that army saying, hey, Hooker's out, Meade's in. That's maybe that point. And I think it also brings into question, Lee has often been quoted as making that famous quote of, George Meade is not going to make a mistake in my front and clearly will take advantage of any that I make in front of his. Right. Well, if he doesn't know that until July 1st, you can call that quote even into question, I think, in some places.
Yeah, so I think ultimately this whole question is unfortunately not definitive. Some people would say that among Lee's staff, Marshall and Long, and on Longstreet's staff, Sorrell, all in their post-war recollections, all say that the news came into camp of the transition on the 28th. I'm going to close my thought on this with Longstreet from Battles and Leaders. He does talk about Harrison's arrival and that Harrison had come through Frederick. And if Harrison was going to learn of this anywhere, it would have been in Frederick. But Longstreet sends Harrison to report to Lee. And again, Longstreet adds in Battles and Leaders that, quote, Meade was then in command of the Federal Army, Hooker having been relieved. But again, if you read it closely, Longstreet doesn't say really where or when we heard it from. So if I had to draw a line in the sand, I'm going to say that I think it's really the 29th. Maybe they've gotten a rumor from Harrison, but between that and the combination of newspapers, I'm going to say the 29th. Lee had high regard for Meade. I believe that general quote, but Meade is also thinking that, geez, making a changeover in the middle of the command like this, in the middle of the campaign, there might be an opportunity here. And I think Lee is thinking this actually might be good news in disguise.
Well, and absolutely. I think, it's going to take time for an army to transition to this new command. You got to know where all the pieces are. You got to get those pieces moving. Lee is maybe thinking, hey, we might, as you said, we may have an opportunity here. I believe he says that actually in the movie.
He does.
But I kind of look at this and I think this is a key moment. In many respects, you could put this as one of the more important moments in the Army of Northern Virginia in their history.
Absolutely.
Because this is going to sort of set the stage for what's going to happen just a few days later in and around Gettysburg, Pennsylvania.
June 28th, folks. June 28th.
A critical day.
A critical day. Should we go with our last question from...
Yeah, let's go ahead and I think put kind of a bow onto the episode with our last listener question.
From Superfan Ken in the Baltimore area.
Superfan Ken from the Baltimore area, absolutely.
Yeah, so Superfan Ken just asked us if we could touch on the role of Custer in the Michigan Cavalry Brigade on June 28th. It's worth noting that as we talk about all these important changes going on in both armies, there is a significant change in the Union Cavalry command structure on June 28th and then carrying it to June 29th, because it is also on this day that Judson Kilpatrick is going to take command of one of the cavalry divisions in the Army of the Potomac, and Special Order number 175 is also issued from Frederick on June 28th. The following named general officers will be assigned to duty with the Cavalry Corps: Brigadier General Elon Farnsworth, Brigadier General George Armstrong Custer, and Brigadier General Wesley Merritt. These three young guys coming in to help revitalize the Cavalry Corps. And of course, of the three, Custer becomes the most famous, but really all three of them play a significant role in the coming battle. And again, that's another thing that happens on the 28th. So even though Custer, Farnsworth, Merritt were not promoted until the 29th, the order itself was actually drafted on June 28th.
This is not only going to have an impact on the Gettysburg campaign, but looking forward, especially the performance of Merritt and Custer in 64, 65. We're seeing them now coming to the forefront and giving just a little bit of maybe added energy, a little bit more vigor to the Union Cavalry moving forward. And this is an important day in that branch.
Yeah, and what will become part of the Michigan Cavalry Brigade, the 5th and 6th Michigan, are actually going to pass through the town of Gettysburg. Catherine Foster, one of the local women in town, would later say that it helped assure the citizenry that the government was keeping an eye on them and that these rebels and their invasion of Pennsylvania were not going unmolested.
Think about when this is happening. This is happening 2 days after Jubal Early's men have passed through the town. It's not without exaggeration to say that that really put a strong scare in the people of Gettysburg. War has now been distant. Now it's coming here. It's not only that, it's the enemy.
Yep.
To see some guys in your own uniform makes you feel pretty good. We often think about, this often gets kind of forgotten, the Union troops come in on the 28th. We often think of June 30th with Buford, but I think this is building to this, maybe reassuring the citizens a little bit moving forward.
Yeah, I often remind folks on tours when I do tours out at East Cavalry Field that it is elements of the Wolverines. What will become Custer's brigade actually enters Gettysburg a few days before Buford. And again, it's another element of the battle in the campaign that people just often don't think of or don't realize.
And of course, Kilpatrick's division in the next 2 days are going to be very busy.
Yep.
We're going to, of course, see the action at Hanover, and then, of course, we'll see their actions here at Gettysburg that they're more noted for. So, yeah, I think a good question. Hopefully we've kind of tied that up
today. Thank you.
So, yeah, we enjoy this. Any questions you have, feel free to ask. It gives us kind of a sense of what we want to do moving forward on the episode. So I think this kind of wraps up June 28th here. So I think we'll start heading home with this one. Do you have anything else to add, Jim?
Just a reminder that, again, Eric and I are both Gettysburg licensed battlefield guides. No matter the season, complete your Gettysburg experience with a personalized battlefield tour from a licensed battlefield guide. We are the only federally licensed guides offering tours of Gettysburg National Military Park, and we have been doing so for over 100 years. Tours are available daily. One way that you can reserve tours is calling our office directly at 717-337-1709 to make advance reservations. You can also go to the Gettysburg Visitor Center on Baltimore Pike, particularly if you're trying to get a same-day tour. But if you want to make advance reservations, you can call the battlefield guides directly. Again, that number is 717-337-1709.
So, folks, when you do book your guide, keep in mind you can customize the tour to whatever you want. If there's a certain aspect of the battle you want to focus on, whether it be July 2nd or the fighting on Culp's Hill, let us know. We are happy to tailor the tours to what you are looking for to give you the best battlefield experience you can have.
So, Eric, I think we're almost out of time as far as June 28th is concerned. What do we have coming up on our next episode?
Our next episode is one that if you frequent any Gettysburg message board or Facebook page on Gettysburg, this question will come up at least once a week. And last week we talked about being, very understanding and encouraging, but this one question seems to really bring out the people. So the question is, for our July 1st episode, what if Stonewall Jackson was at Gettysburg? Now, we've already said we don't do hypotheticals, and we are not doing hypotheticals. So we're going to be looking at July 1st through the prism of Jackson's death, and also looking at Jackson as a figure in his life as a commander. So we'll kind of take a look at this, focus a lot on Richard Ewell and the Second Corps and some of those decisions, and really look at, would Jackson have had that much of an impact here, even if he had lived?
Can't wait. Hey, Eric, I did want to mention one event that I'll be co-hosting on Saturday, August 3rd from 1 o'clock to 5 o'clock in the afternoon. We're going to be over at the Gettysburg Heritage Center at 297 Steinway Avenue, and we're co-hosting the first annual George Armstrong Custer in the Indian Wars 2019 Gettysburg Symposium. We're going to have a lineup of great speakers talking about the Indian Wars. We hope folks will come out. You can get your tickets through the Gettysburg Heritage Center. Again, that's at 297 Steinway Avenue, and their phone number is 717-334-6245. Come out and ride Space Mountain with George Armstrong Custer, and we hope some of you folks will come see us on Saturday, August 3rd at the Gettysburg Heritage Center. All the details are on the Heritage Center's website. Go check it out. So I guess in closing, I'm licensed battlefield guide James Hessler.
I'm licensed battlefield guide Eric Lindblade. We want to thank you for listening to us this week. We also want to thank the Reliance Mine Saloon for once again graciously giving us the space to record. If you're in town, certainly show your support and thanks by stopping in and having a drink, and we'll see you guys next week.
Take care.